You never expect your worst moment to become your salvation. Walter Briggs certainly didn't when he crashed his car into the Virgin Mary statue on County Road 14. At 45, Walter had become a man who disappointed himself daily. Empty bottles, lost jobs, broken promises, that was his life now. But on this August evening, with whiskey in his blood and despair in his heart, everything changed in an instant. The crash should have killed him. Instead, he crawled out of the wreckage and found himself face to face with something impossible. The statue's body lay shattered around him, but somehow her hands remained perfectly intact, still clasped in prayer, still glorious in the fading twilight. As Walter stood there, bleeding and alone among the broken pieces, those praying hands seemed to offer something he hadn't felt in years. What could a broken drunk find in that sacred wreckage that would sober him completely? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through grimy windows into Walter Briggs's kitchen, illuminating a collection of empty bottles that stood like silent witnesses to his slow-motion collapse. Jack Daniels, Jim Beam, whatever, was cheapest at Murphy's Liquor. They will serve the same purpose. Each bottle marked another evening when he'd chosen numbness over facing what his life had become. Walter sat at his small Formica table, nursing black coffee and a headache that felt like punishment itself. The rental house around him told the story of a man who'd given up caring. Dishes stacked in the sink, laundry piled on chairs, bills unopened on the counter. At 45, he lived like a college student, except college students had hope for something better. He hadn't always been this way. The evidence sat in his garage, a weathered red toolbox that had belonged to his father, Frank Briggs. Walter could remember being 8 years old, watching his dad's calloused hands work magic with those tools. Frank had been a carpenter, the kind who built things to last generations. "A man's hands tell his story," Frank used to say, examining Walter's small palms. "Make sure yours tell one worth reading." Those words echoed differently now as Walter stared at his own hands, soft from years of desk jobs, trembling slightly from last night's whiskey. When had he stopped building and started breaking everything he touched? The decline hadn't happened overnight. It started with his marriage to Claire. She'd been the prettiest girl in Millbrook, smart enough to get into college, but foolish enough to fall for Walter's charm. They married young, had Emma when they were barely ready, and for a while it worked. Walter sold insurance, made decent money, played the role of suburban husband and father, but somewhere along the way, the role became too heavy to carry. The insurance business meant selling people protection from disasters while watching disasters happen anyway. Car accidents, house fires, medical bankruptcies. Walter spent his days calculating how much tragedy was worth in dollars and cents. He started drinking to forget the claims he'd denied, the families he couldn't help, the growing certainty that life was just an elaborate shell game where everybody lost eventually. Claire tried to save him. God knows she tried. She hid bottles, poured them down drains, scheduled interventions with friends who still cared, but Walter had become an expert at hiding his drinking, at functioning just well enough to avoid consequences. He showed up to work, paid the bills, attended Emma's school plays with whiskey on his breath, disguised by mints and cologne. The end came 3 years ago when Emma was 14. Walter had promised to pick her up from soccer practice, but stopped at Murphy's Liquor instead. 1 drink became 4. 4 became forgetting entirely. Emma waited 2 hours in the rain before Claire came looking. When Walter finally stumbled home at midnight, slurring apologies, Claire was waiting with suitcases packed. "I can't watch you kill yourself anymore," she'd said, her voice steady despite the tears. "And I won't let you. Take Emma down with you." That night, Walter's family walked out of his life, leaving him alone with his bottles and his excuses. He told himself it was temporary, that he'd get sober and win them back. Instead, he lost his job 6 months later. Showing up drunk to a client meeting was the final straw. Without work to anchor him, Walter drifted from one odd job to another, always finding reasons why nothing was his fault. His sister Sarah tried to help, but Walter had become skilled at pushing away anyone who threatened his relationship with alcohol. Sarah, 2 years younger and infinitely wiser, worked as a nurse at Millbrook General. She'd seen what drinking could do to families, had watched it destroy their own father in the final years before his death. Frank Briggs had never been a drunk, but grief over Walter's mother's cancer had driven him to bottles near the end. Sarah remembered, even if Walter chose to forget. "You're becoming him," Sarah had told Walter during their last real conversation 6 months ago. "Dad drank himself to death after Mom died, and you're doing the same thing, except you don't even have that excuse." Walter had responded with the anger that drunks reserve for people who tell them the truth. He'd said things he couldn't take, back things that made Sarah's face crumple with disappointment. She'd left his house that night, and they hadn't spoken since, except for brief, cold exchanges when their paths crossed in Millbrook's small downtown. The town itself seemed to watch Walter's decline with the patient sadness of a place that had seen too many promising young men lose their way. Millbrook had been built around a lumber mill that closed in the 80s, leaving behind the kind of economic uncertainty that made drinking seem reasonable. The town's main street still had charm. Murphy's barber shop, Kowalski's diner, the old brick library where Mrs. Henderson had worked for 40 years. But it also had too many empty storefronts and too many men Walter's age who'd given up on tomorrow. At the center of town stood St. Catherine's Catholic Church, a modest brick building where Father Martinez had ministered for 15 years. Father Martinez was Walter's age, a man who'd come to Millbrook after his own struggles with faith and purpose. He'd tried to reach Walter several times over the years, showing up at his door with offers of coffee and conversation. Walter had always been polite but distant, unwilling to let anyone get close enough to see the full extent of his damage. The Virgin Mary statue stood just outside the town limits on County Road 14, at a sharp curve where the road bent around Miller's Creek. It had been erected 37 years ago, shortly after Walter's birth, though he'd never bothered to learn the story behind it. The statue was simple: white marble, 8 feet tall, Mary with her hands clasped in prayer, her face serene and watchful. Generations of Millbrook residents had driven past her daily, some offering quick prayers, others barely noticing her presence. Walter knew the statue well because County Road 14 was his route home from Murphy's Liquor. He'd passed her hundreds of times over the years, always at the end of evenings that started with just one drink and ended with him struggling to keep his car between the lines. The curve where she stood was sharp enough to demand attention, even from drunk drivers. Until last night, Walter had always managed to navigate it safely. Last night had been different. Walter couldn't even remember what had triggered it. Maybe Emma's birthday passing without a call, maybe another rejection, letter from a potential employer, maybe just the accumulated weight of 3 years spent disappointing himself daily. He'd started drinking earlier than usual, sitting in his kitchen with a bottle of cheap whiskey and a head full of regrets. By sunset, Walter was drunk enough to make the decision that changed everything. He'd gotten behind the wheel of his 10-year-old Honda Civic, telling himself he just needed air, just needed to drive. County Road 14 stretched ahead of him in the dying light, familiar and safe until it wasn't. The crash itself remained a blur of metal and marble, of momentum meeting immovable faith. Walter remembered the moment of impact, the way time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. He remembered the sound, not just the crunch of metal and stone, but something deeper, like the world itself sighing in disappointment. When he crawled out of the wreckage, bleeding from small cuts and miracle intact, Walter found himself surrounded by pieces of sacred art that he'd destroyed in a moment of selfish recklessness. The statue's body lay scattered around his car, chunks of white marble catching the last light of day. But somehow, impossibly, her hands remained perfect, still clasped in prayer, still beautiful, still offering something Walter couldn't name. Standing there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the evidence of his latest destruction, Walter felt something shift inside him. Not redemption. That would come later, if it came at all, but recognition. For the first time in years, he saw himself clearly. A 45-year-old man who'd spent so long running from pain that he'd forgotten how to stand still long enough to heal. The sound of sirens in the distance meant his reckoning was coming. But in that moment, before the world intruded, Walter made a choice that would define everything that followed. Instead of running, instead of making excuses, instead of blaming the curve or the darkness or the whiskey, he stayed. He stood among the broken pieces of something beautiful and waited to face the consequences of what he'd done. That decision, to stay, to face the truth, to stop running, would prove to be the first step on a journey Walter couldn't yet imagine. A journey that would transform not just his own life, but the entire community that had watched him fall and wondered if he could ever find his way back up. The sirens grew louder as Walter stood among the wreckage, still swaying slightly from the whiskey and shock. His first instinct was to run, disappear into the woods that lined County Road 14, walk home cross-country, pretend this never happened. The old Walter would have done exactly that, would have constructed elaborate stories about hit-and-run drivers and mysterious accidents. But something about those marble hands, still perfect in their prayer, held him in place. They seemed to be waiting for him to make a choice between the man he'd always been and the man he might still become. The first patrol car rounded the curve with lights flashing, illuminating the scene in harsh blues and reds. Walter recognized the vehicle. Before he saw the driver, Deputy Tom Morrison, who'd been 2 years behind Walter in high school. Tom had been a quiet kid then, serious about his studies, while Walter had been more interested in parties and popularity. Now Tom was the one with authority and purpose, while Walter stood drunk beside a pile of broken marble. Tom parked carefully and approached with his hand resting on his duty belt, not threatening but ready. "Walter, you okay? What happened here?" Walter could have lied, should have lied. The smart play was to claim he'd swerved to avoid a deer, lost control, hit the statue accidentally. Tom might believe it, might give him the benefit of doubt they'd shared as teenagers playing pickup basketball behind the school. Instead, Walter heard himself telling the truth. "I was drinking, Tom. Lost control coming around the curve. I did this." Tom stopped walking, clearly surprised by the honest confession. In 15 years of police work in Millbrook, he'd rarely heard such immediate accountability. Most people spent considerable energy explaining why their mistakes weren't really their fault. "You been drinking tonight, Walter?" "Since about 4 o'clock. Walter's voice was steady, almost relieved to finally say it out loud. "Bottle of whiskey, cheap stuff. Should have known better." Tom pulled out his flashlight and examined the scene. The crumpled Honda wedged against the statue's base, broken marble scattered across the asphalt, Walter standing calmly amid the destruction, like a man accepting judgment. "You hurt? Need an ambulance?" Walter touched the small cuts on his face and hands, feeling the sting of broken glass and scraped skin. "Nothing serious. Just my pride and whatever's left of my soul." The comment might have sounded self-pitying, but Tom heard something different. In Walter's tone, genuine regret rather than self-pity. This wasn't the Walter Briggs who'd made excuses for every failure over the past 3 years. This was someone else entirely, someone Tom barely recognized. "I'm going to need you to do a sobriety test, Walter. You understand?" "I understand. I'll fail it. We both know that." Tom administered the tests anyway, following procedure even though the outcome was never in doubt. Walter stumbled through the walk-the-line test, couldn't touch his nose with his eyes closed, blew a blood alcohol content that put him well over the legal limit. Tom documented everything carefully, professionally, but without the edge of satisfaction that sometimes came with catching someone in obvious wrongdoing. By the time the tow truck arrived to pull Walter's Honda off the statue's remains, word was spreading through Millbrook's tight network of relationships. Mrs. Henderson from the library lived just down the road and had heard the crash. She'd called her daughter, who called the pastor's wife, who called 3 other families before Father Martinez even learned what happened. Father Martinez arrived as Tom was placing Walter in handcuffs, a formality required by law, though both men treated it with appropriate solemnity rather than drama. "Walter," Father Martinez said simply, his voice carrying concern rather than judgment. "Are you all right?" "Father, I'm sorry. I know what this statue meant to people. I'll find a way to make it right." Father Martinez looked at the scattered marble, then at Walter's face, seeing something there that surprised him. In 15 years of ministry, he'd counseled many people through crises, had learned to distinguish between genuine remorse and performance. Walter's expression held no calculation, no attempt to manipulate sympathy, just raw honesty about damage. "Done. We'll talk more later," Father Martinez said. "Right now, let's focus on getting you through tonight safely." The ride to the county jail passed in silence. Walter staring out the window at familiar streets that looked different from the back of a police car. Millbrook's houses glowed with warm light, families settling in for evening routines, children finishing homework, couples sharing quiet conversations. Life continuing normally while Walter's world shifted beneath him. At the jail, Tom processed, Walter with efficiency tempered by old friendship. The booking photos, fingerprints, and paperwork created an official record of Walter's lowest moment. But Tom handled everything with quiet dignity. "You'll likely be here overnight," Tom explained as he locked Walter into the holding cell. "Judge Morrison, no relation, will see you in the morning for arraignment. You'll need a lawyer." "Tom," Walter called as the deputy prepared to leave. "Thank you for treating me like a human being tonight. I know I didn't deserve it." Tom paused at the cell door. "Walter, I've known you since we were kids. You made a terrible mistake tonight, could have killed someone. But you owned up to it immediately, didn't try to run or lie your way out. That counts for something." Alone in the cell, Walter experienced his first sober hours in months. The whiskey worked its way out of his system gradually, leaving him clear-headed enough to fully comprehend what he'd done. He'd destroyed something sacred, something that had stood watch over his community for nearly 4 decades. Worse, he'd done it in a moment of selfish self-pity, driving drunk on roads where children played and families lived. The physical withdrawal was manageable. Mild shakes, slight nausea, nothing compared to the emotional reckoning taking place in his mind. For years, Walter had lived in a fog of alcohol and rationalization, always finding ways to blame external circumstances for his problems. The job market, the economy, Claire's unrealistic expectations, Emma's teenage distance, everything except his own choices. But clarity was a harsh companion. Sober and alone, Walter could no longer hide from the pattern of his life. Promise followed by disappointment, good intentions undermined by weak follow-through, relationships destroyed by his inability to choose. Anything over the bottle. Around midnight, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Walter expected another deputy, but Sarah appeared at his cell door, her nurse's uniform wrinkled from a long shift at the hospital. "Hello, Walter. How did you know I was here?" "Millbrook's a small town. Word travels fast." Sarah's voice carried exhaustion, not just from work, but from years of watching her brother destroy himself. "Tom Morrison called me. Thought you might need someone to post bail." Walter looked at his sister, steady, reliable Sarah, who'd tried so many times to help him. She looked older than her 43 years, worn down by night shifts and family disappointments. "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering. Though I have conditions, such as, you get help, real help, not just promises. To do better, but actual treatment. There's a program at the hospital, meetings at the church. You commit to it, or this is the last time I help you with anything." Walter gripped the cell bars, feeling their cold reality. "Sarah, I destroyed that statue. People are going to hate me. Some will, others might surprise you, but that's not what matters right now. What matters is whether you're finally ready to stop destroying yourself." looking at his sister's tired face. Walter realized she was offering him something more valuable than bail money. She was offering him accountability, structure, and the kind of love that demanded change rather than enabling destruction. "I'm ready," he said, and for the first time in years, he meant it completely. Sarah posted Walter's bail at 6 in the morning, driving him home through a millbrook that felt different in the grey dawn light. The town looked the same: Murphy's barbershop with its spinning pole, the old library with ivy creeping up its brick walls, the diner where coffee and gossip flowed in equal measure. But Walter saw it now through the eyes of someone who'd become the subject of that gossip, the cautionary tale parents would tell their teenagers about the consequences of poor choices. "The arraignment is Monday," Sarah said as they pulled into Walter's driveway. "Judge Morrison will set your court date, discuss bail conditions. You'll need a lawyer." Walter stared at his rental house, seeing it as if for the first time. The peeling paint, the overgrown lawn, the newspapers he'd been too drunk to collect, all evidence of a man who'd stopped caring about anything, including himself. "I can't afford a lawyer. Public defender, then." "But Walter, that's the least of your problems. You need to get sober and stay sober. Everything else is just details." Inside the house, Walter found Emma's childhood drawing, still tucked in his wallet where he'd carried it for 3 years. She'd made it when she was 7, a stick-figure family holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Mom, Dad, and Emma, all smiling with that unconditional happiness children draw before they understand how easily families can break apart. The drawing had survived bar fights, blackouts, and countless nights when Walter had passed out on his couch, fully clothed. He'd never thrown it away, though he'd rarely looked at it either. Now, studying Emma's careful crayon work, he realized it wasn't just a drawing. It was a reminder of what he'd lost, and maybe, with enormous effort, what he might still salvage. The first day of sobriety was a revelation of misery, without alcohol. To blur the edges, everything felt sharp and immediate. The headache, the nausea, the way his hands shook when he tried to hold his coffee cup, these were manageable. Harder to bear was the emotional withdrawal, the way feelings he'd suppressed for years came flooding back with interest. He called in sick to his part-time job at Peterson's Hardware, though sick didn't adequately describe his condition. He was detoxing from more than alcohol. He was detoxing from the elaborate system of lies and justifications that had allowed him to function as a barely controlled drunk for 3 years. By afternoon, Walter felt restless enough to drive. His Honda was totaled, but Sarah had loaned him her old pickup truck. He found himself drawn back to County Road 14, to the scene of his crime. In daylight, the destruction looked worse than he'd remembered. Chunks of marble lay scattered across 50 feet of roadway. The statue's base remained intact, but everything above it was gone except for those miraculous hands still clasped in prayer, still somehow beautiful, despite the violence that had surrounded them. Father Martinez was there, carefully collecting pieces of marble and placing them in cardboard boxes. He looked up as Walter approached, showing no surprise at seeing him return to the scene. "I wondered when you'd come back," the priest said. "I needed to see it in daylight, to understand what I really did." Father Martinez straightened, his back protesting the work of gathering broken stones. He was Walter's age, but carried himself with the dignity that came from purposeful living. "What do you see?" Walter looked around at the destruction, his car's skid marks on the asphalt, the gouges in the statue's base, the marble fragments glinting in the afternoon sun. "I see that I destroyed something beautiful, something that meant something to people, and I see that I can't undo it, but maybe I can find a way to make it right." Father Martinez smiled, not with forgiveness exactly, but with something that might grow into forgiveness if Walter proved worthy of it. "That's a start, though making it right won't be simple or quick. How much will it cost to replace the statue?" "More than you have, I'd guess." "The original was carved by an artisan in Italy, shipped here in 1986. A replacement, if we can find someone to do the work, would probably cost $15,000 or more. The number hit Walter like a physical blow. $15,000 represented more money than he'd saved in his entire adult life. Even if he worked steadily at Peterson's Hardware for 2 years, he'd barely earn enough to cover the replacement. "Father, I don't have that kind of money. I can barely keep the lights on in my house." "Then you'll have to get creative or find other ways to make amends." That evening, Walter attended his first AA meeting in the basement of St. Catherine's Church. He'd been to meetings before, court-ordered sessions after a DUI 5 years earlier, but never as someone who genuinely wanted to be there. The difference was profound. 12 people sat in a circle of folding chairs, sharing stories that echoed Walter's own experience with uncomfortable accuracy. There was Margaret, a retired teacher who'd hidden wine bottles throughout her house. Jim, a mechanic who'd lost 3 jobs to drinking. Lisa, barely 30, who'd been sober for 6 months after a blackout that nearly killed her infant daughter. When Walter's turn came to share, he found himself telling the truth without embellishment or excuse. "I'm Walter, and I'm an alcoholic. Last night I drove drunk and destroyed something that didn't belong to me, something sacred. I want to make it right, but I don't know how." The group received his confession without judgment, responding with the kind of nods that came from people who understood the weight of acknowledging damage done. After the meeting, Margaret approached him with a cup of coffee and a perspective earned through 20 years of sobriety. "Making amends isn't just about money," she said. "Sometimes it's about becoming the person who would never have caused the harm in the first place." Walking home from the meeting, Walter felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope mixed with purpose. Not the grandiose plans that drunks make in moments of inspiration, but the steady recognition that he had work to do, both on himself and for his community. At home, he began the process of taking inventory of his life. The exercise was humbling. His bank account held $347. His possessions fit easily into 2 rooms. His relationships were damaged or destroyed. His reputation in Millbrook was now defined by a single moment of destructive selfishness. But he also had assets he'd forgotten, hands that remembered his father's lessons about craftsmanship, a mind that functioned clearly when not poisoned by alcohol, and a community that might, possibly, give him a chance to prove he could change. Before bed, Walter made a decision that would define everything that followed. He opened an old mason jar that had been collecting dust in his kitchen cabinet and placed $5 inside, half of what remained in his wallet after buying groceries. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a commitment made visible, a promise to himself and to the memory of something sacred he'd destroyed. The jar would become his church restoration fund, growing coin by coin, dollar by dollar, as Walter rebuilt his life one honest day at a time. 2 weeks into sobriety, Walter's hands had stopped shaking, but his resolve was tested daily. Every dollar he earned went into the mason jar, except for basic necessities: rent, utilities, the cheapest food that would sustain him. The jar held $43 now, a pathetic amount compared to the thousands needed for a statue replacement. But each coin represented a choice to save rather than drink. At Peterson's Hardware, Walter threw himself into work with an intensity that surprised his boss. He arrived early, stayed late, and volunteered for every odd job that came through the store. When Mrs. Patterson needed her porch steps repaired, Walter offered to do the work at cost. When the Kowalski family's fence blew down in a storm, he spent his Saturday rebuilding it for the price of materials alone. "You're working yourself to death," Pete Peterson observed, watching Walter reorganize the store's entire inventory system during what should have been his lunch break. "What's driving this sudden work ethic?" Walter paused, considering how much truth to share. "I destroyed something that mattered to people, Pete. I'm trying to figure out how to make it right." Pete, who'd known Walter since high school and had watched his decline with quiet disappointment, nodded thoughtfully. That statue meant a lot to folks. My own mother used to pray there every morning on her way to work. Said it gave her comfort knowing Mary was watching over travelers. The weight of what he'd destroyed grew heavier with each story Walter heard. The statue hadn't just been decoration. It had been a source of genuine comfort for people facing daily struggles. Truck drivers crossing the state, families traveling to medical appointments, teenagers nervous about driving tests. All had found reassurance in that marble figure's steady presence. Father Martinez became Walter's unofficial mentor, stopping by the hardware store or appearing at Walter's house with offers of coffee and conversation. The priest had a gift for asking questions that made Walter think rather than providing easy answers. "Tell me about your father," Father Martinez said one evening as they sat on Walter's porch, watching the sun set over Millbrook's tired streets. "He was a good man. Carpenter. Built half the houses in this neighborhood back in the 70s and 80s. Walter's voice carried admiration mixed with regret. He had principles, did honest work, treated people fairly, never made promises he couldn't keep. Sounds like someone you respected. Loved him. Wanted to be like him when I grew up." Walter laughed bitterly. Obviously, that didn't work out. Why not? The question was simple, but it cut through years of excuses and self-pity. Walter found himself remembering his father's weathered hands, the way Frank Briggs had approached every project with patience and precision. Building wasn't just work for Frank. It was a form of prayer, a way of leaving the world slightly better than he'd found it. "I got impatient," Walter said finally. "Dad's way was slow, steady, build something right, build it to last. I wanted shortcuts, wanted success without the foundation work. And now I'm learning that shortcuts just lead to bigger detours." That weekend, Walter opened his father's toolbox for the first time since Frank's death. The tools were old but well-maintained. Hammers with smooth wooden handles, chisels sharp enough to cut paper, measuring squares that still ran true. Each tool held memories of lessons learned in Frank's workshop, of a patient man teaching his son that quality. Work required quality tools and careful attention to detail. Walter began using the tools for small projects around his house, fixing loose cabinet doors, replacing rotted boards on his porch, weather-stripping windows that had let cold air seep through for years. The work felt like meditation, each careful measurement and precise cut reconnecting him to his father's values. Sarah noticed the changes during her weekly visits, which had become less confrontational and more supportive as Walter proved his commitment to sobriety. She found him one Saturday morning in his backyard, building a small workshop from scrap lumber he'd bought with his hardware store discount. "What's this for?" she asked, admiring the precise joints and careful construction. "Practice. I'm thinking about taking on carpentry jobs, building up the restoration fund faster." Walter tested a joint with his father's square, satisfied with its trueness. "People around here need things fixed, and I need to remember how to build instead of just breaking things down." Sarah watched her brother work, seeing echoes of their father in Walter's careful movements. Frank Briggs had been dead for 5 years, but his influence lived on in the tools and techniques he'd passed down to his son. "Dad would be proud," she said quietly. "Maybe. He'd also tell me I waited too long to get my act together." Their relationship was healing gradually, like a broken bone knitting stronger than before. Sarah had stopped expecting disappointment from Walter, while Walter had stopped resenting her attempts to help. They talked now like siblings who genuinely cared about each other rather than people bound only by blood and shared trauma. One evening, Claire called, their first conversation since the accident. Walter's heart raced as he heard her voice, hope and anxiety warring in his chest. "I heard what happened," she said without preamble. "Tom Morrison's wife works at the bank with my sister. She said you confessed immediately, didn't try to run or make excuses." "That's right. Emma wants to see you. She's confused about the statue thing, but she's heard you're trying to make it right." Walter gripped the phone tighter, afraid to hope too much. I'd like that. Very much. Sunday afternoon, 1 hour at the park. Don't disappoint her again. Walter? The call ended before Walter could promise anything, but he didn't need to make promises anymore. He needed to make choices, day by day, that would rebuild trust through actions rather than words. Sunday's visit with Emma was awkward at first. She'd grown taller in the months since he'd seen her, more like the young woman she was becoming than the little girl who'd drawn stick figures of their family. But when Walter showed her his workshop project and let her help him sand a piece of oak he was shaping into a small table, the old connection flickered back to life. "Mum says you're not drinking anymore," Emma said, focusing on her sandpaper. "Strokes. That's right. Every day I don't drink is a choice I make to be better." "Are you better?" Walter considered the question carefully. "I'm working on it. Every day." Emma nodded, accepting the honesty. They worked together in comfortable silence, father and daughter rebuilding something between them, one careful stroke at a time. 3 months into his sobriety, Walter's reputation in Millbrook was slowly shifting from cautionary tale to cautious hope. The mason jar in his kitchen now held $237. Not enough for a statue replacement, but visible proof of sustained commitment. More importantly, Walter had begun taking on carpentry jobs that paid better than his hardware store wages and gave him the satisfaction his father had found in honest craftsmanship. Mrs. Kowalski had been his first real customer outside of charity work. Her kitchen cabinets, installed in 1974, were showing their age with sagging doors and loose hinges. Walter's bid was half what the contractors from Millbrook's neighboring towns had quoted, and his references, Pete Peterson and Father Martinez, convinced her to take a chance on him. The work took 2 weeks of evenings and weekends. Walter approached each cabinet with the patience his father had taught him, measuring twice, cutting once, testing every joint before moving to the next step. When he finished, Mrs. Kowalski's kitchen looked 20 years younger, and more importantly, Walter felt like the man his father had raised him to be. She paid him in cash and added something unexpected, a handwritten thank you note on lavender stationery. "Dear Walter," it read, "Thank you not just for the beautiful work, but for reminding me that people can change when they truly want to. Your father would be proud." Walter read the note 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in his toolbox next to his father's measuring square. It was the first compliment he'd received in years that wasn't qualified with concern. About his drinking, word spread through Millbrook's network of relationships. Mrs. Patterson recommended Walter to her sister in the next county. The Hendersons hired him to build built-in bookshelves for their library addition. Each job was small, but they accumulated into something larger, a growing reputation as someone who did quality work at fair prices and could be trusted to show up sober and on time. Father Martinez watched Walter's transformation with the careful attention of someone who'd seen many attempts at redemption fail at the crucial moment when initial enthusiasm met ongoing difficulty. But Walter seemed different, steadier, more grounded in the daily work of change rather than the drama of grand gestures. "You're building more than furniture," Father Martinez observed one evening as he watched Walter install a custom mantelpiece for the church's fellowship hall. "How do you mean?" "Character, reputation, the kind of foundation that can support something lasting." Walter tested the mantle's level 1 more time before securing it permanently. "I'm trying to remember who I used to be before I forgot how to be that person." Their friendship had deepened beyond mentor and student into something approaching equals. Father Martinez had his own story of struggle, not with alcohol, but with doubt that had nearly driven him from the priesthood 10 years earlier. He'd come to Millbrook not as an assignment, but as a refuge, seeking to rebuild his faith through service to people who needed practical help more than theological sophistication. "I almost quit," Father Martinez confided one evening as they worked together staining the mantelpiece. "Had a crisis of faith that made me question everything I'd believed about God's presence in the world." "What changed your mind?" "This place. These people. I learned that faith isn't about having answers. It's about showing up consistently, especially when you don't feel like it. Walter understood. Sobriety was teaching him the same lesson. Every day he chose not to drink wasn't about feeling strong or inspired. It was about showing up for his commitments, regardless of how he felt. The Mantelpiece Project introduced Walter to Giuseppe Torino, an 80-year-old retired sculptor who lived on the outskirts of Millbrook. Giuseppe had emigrated from Italy in 1960, bringing with him skills learned in workshops that had produced art for centuries. When Father Martinez mentioned Walter's situation, Giuseppe had offered to examine the statue's remains. "She was beautiful work," Giuseppe said, running his weathered fingers over a piece of the broken statue's face. Carrara marble, carved by someone who understood the stone's personality. They stood in Giuseppe's workshop, surrounded by half-finished sculptures and the tools of a lifetime spent shaping stone into art. Walter felt overwhelmed by the old man's expertise and the magnitude of what he'd destroyed. Could it be repaired? Giuseppe shook his head sadly. Too many pieces, too much damage, but it could be replaced. Would take time, proper stone, someone who understands the original spirit. How much time? For me? 6 months, maybe 8? But I'm old, my hands not as steady as they were. Giuseppe smiled, his eyes twinkling with possibility. Unless I had help, young hands to do the heavy work, old mind to guide the details. The offer hung in the air between them. Walter knew nothing about sculpture, had never worked with anything. Harder than oak. But something about Giuseppe's workshop, the smell of stone dust, the way light fell across unfinished figures, felt familiar, like his father's carpentry shop, scaled up to something more ambitious. "I don't have money to pay you," Walter said honestly. "Who mentioned money? You destroyed something beautiful. I'm offering you a chance to create something beautiful. Payment is the satisfaction of work done right." That evening, Walter called Sarah to tell her about Giuseppe's offer. She listened carefully, asking practical questions about timing and logistics that showed she was taking his commitment seriously. 8 months is a long time, Walter. That's a lot of days to stay sober, a lot of opportunities to quit when things get difficult. I know, but Sarah, when I was in that workshop today, I felt something I haven't felt since Dad died. Like I was remembering how to be useful instead of just getting by. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Dad always said you had the best hands in the family. Maybe it's time to prove him right. The next day, Walter gave Pete Peterson notice at the hardware store. Pete understood. Even helped Walter line up additional carpentry jobs to sustain him through the sculpture training. "You're taking a big risk," Pete warned. "Giuseppe's a master, but he's demanding, doesn't suffer fools or quitters." "Good," Walter replied. "I've been too easy on myself for too long." His first week in Giuseppe's workshop was humbling. The old sculptor demanded precision that made Walter's carpentry work seem casual by comparison. Marble was unforgiving. One mistaken chisel strike could ruin hours of careful progress. But gradually, Walter began to understand the stone's language. Giuseppe taught him to read the grain, to feel where the marble wanted to break and where it would resist. The work was meditation made physical, requiring focus, that left no room for dwelling on past failures or future anxieties. "Stone teaches patience," Giuseppe explained, watching Walter struggle with a practice piece. "Hurry the marble, it breaks. Respect its nature, it becomes whatever you envision." The lesson applied to more than sculpture. Walter's entire life was becoming an exercise in patient reconstruction, one careful choice at a time. 6 months into his apprenticeship with Giuseppe, Walter's hands had developed the calluses and certainty that came from daily work with stone. The mason jar in his kitchen now held over $800, supplemented by his carpentry jobs, and a growing confidence that he might actually complete this impossible project. Giuseppe had loaned him a set of carving tools, chisels and rasps worn smooth by decades of use, each one shaped by the old sculptor's hands to perform specific tasks. Walter treated them with the reverence his father's tools had once inspired. cleaning and sharpening them each evening before heading home. Tools have memory, Giuseppe explained, watching Walter work on a practice piece that was slowly emerging as a dove. These chisels have carved angels, saints, memorial markers for people whose names are forgotten but whose love is still remembered in stone. The work had changed Walter in ways he hadn't expected. The physical demands, hours spent bent over marble, the precise control required for each strike, had strengthened his body and focused his mind. More importantly, it had given him a sense of purpose that went beyond simple penance. Emma had become a regular visitor to the workshop, fascinated by the transformation of raw stone into recognizable forms. Her relationship with Walter was healing slowly, built on Saturday afternoons, spent learning to use rasps and watching her father discover skills he'd never known he possessed. "It looks like her," Emma said, studying Walter's latest work, a half-finished face that was beginning to resemble the original Virgin Mary statue. "Giuseppe has photographs from when it was first installed. We're trying to capture not just her appearance, but her spirit." Emma traced the emerging features with her finger, careful not to disturb the stone dust. "Why do you think her hands didn't break in the crash?" Walter paused in his work, considering the question that had haunted him for months. "I don't know. Maybe they were positioned just right, protected by the car's angle. Maybe it was luck. Or maybe," Emma said quietly, "they were meant to survive, to give you something to hold on to." The wisdom in his daughter's words struck Walter like a physical blow. At 17, Emma understood things about forgiveness and redemption that had taken him 45 years to begin learning. Claire had begun allowing longer visits, and Walter treasured each conversation with his daughter. Emma was applying to colleges now, planning a future that might include room for a father who'd learned to be present and reliable. The possibility filled Walter with hope and terror in equal measure. Giuseppe's health had been declining gradually, forcing Walter to take on more of the detailed work as the old sculptor's hands became less steady. It was a promotion earned through months of patient learning, and Giuseppe granted it with the pride of a master watching his student mature. "Soon you won't need me," Giuseppe said, watching Walter work on the statue's flowing robes with increasing confidence. "I'll always need you, Giuseppe. You taught me to see beauty in stone. No, my friend, I taught you to see beauty you already carried inside. Stone just makes it visible." The community's response to Walter's project had evolved from skepticism to grudging respect to genuine admiration. Father Martinez had organized fundraising efforts that helped cover the cost of marble and tools, while Mrs. Kowalski started a collection jar at her diner that filled steadily with donations from people who wanted to support Walter's redemption effort. But not everyone approved. A town meeting called to discuss the memorial replacement revealed deep divisions in Millbrook's small community. Some residents, led by Bill Patterson, argued that Walter shouldn't be allowed to profit from his own destructive act. "He destroyed that statue," Patterson said, his voice carrying the anger of someone who'd never made a public mistake. "Now he wants to play hero by replacing it. That's not justice. That's reward for bad behavior." Walter attended the meeting, but didn't speak in his own defense. Instead, Father Martinez and Giuseppe addressed the concerns with quiet dignity. "Walter isn't profiting from this work," Father Martinez explained. "He's donating his labor, paying for materials from his own earnings, spending every free hour learning skills he'll use to create something beautiful for our community." Giuseppe, despite his age and failing health, stood to address the room with the authority that came from a lifetime of creating beauty. "I have worked with stone for 60 years. I have seen many artists, some gifted, some merely competent. Walter Briggs has gifts. More importantly, he has heart. The statue he creates will be more than replacement. It will be testimony to possibility of redemption." The vote was close, 17 in favor, 12 opposed, but it was enough. Walter's project would continue with official community support. That night, Walter called Sarah to share the news. She'd attended the meeting but hadn't spoken, allowing the community to make its own decision about her brother's worthiness. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "Not for winning the vote, but for facing the opposition with dignity. Dad would have done the same thing. I almost defended myself, almost got angry and said things I'd regret later. But you didn't. That's growth, Walter. That's the difference between who you were and who you're becoming." The next morning, Walter arrived at Giuseppe's workshop to find the old sculptor moving slowly, his hands trembling more than usual. Giuseppe tried to hide his condition, but Walter had learned to read the signs of his mentor's declining health. "We need to finish the statue soon," Giuseppe said quietly. "My hands are betraying me, and I won't be able to guide the delicate work much longer." The admission hung between them like a deadline they'd both been avoiding. Walter calculated the remaining work, 6 weeks, maybe 8, if they pushed themselves. It was achievable, but only if Giuseppe's health held and Walter's skills proved equal to the most challenging aspects of the sculpture. "Then we finish it," Walter said, picking up his chisel with new determination. "Together." Giuseppe smiled, and for a moment his hands steadied, as if responding to Walter's certainty. "Yes, together we finish what you began the night you chose, to stay and face what you had done." Outside the workshop, spring was arriving in Millbrook, with the quiet persistence that characterized everything meaningful in Walter's new life. One careful day at a time, one precise chisel strike at a time, he was building something that would outlast his mistakes and stand as proof that even the most broken lives could be made whole again. The discovery happened on a Tuesday morning in late April, while Walter was clearing debris from the statue's original foundation to prepare for the new installation. Giuseppe had insisted they examine the original base for structural integrity, and Father Martinez had obtained permission for Walter to dig around the site. 3 feet down, Walter's shovel struck something that wasn't stone or soil. He knelt and brushed dirt away from what appeared to be a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in plastic and sealed with tape that had somehow survived nearly 4 decades underground. Father Martinez arrived as Walter was lifting the box from its hiding place. The priest's face showed no surprise, only the resigned expression of someone whose secret was finally being revealed. "You knew this was here," Walter said. "It wasn't a question. I've known for 15 years, since my predecessor told me before he retired. Father McKenna buried it when the statue was dedicated in 1986. He said someone would find it when the time was right." Walter carried the box to Giuseppe's workshop, where the 3 men examined it under proper light. The tape was brittle but intact, the plastic wrapping still protecting whatever lay inside. Walter's hands shook slightly as he opened it. Not from alcohol withdrawal, which was long past, but from the certainty that whatever he found would change everything. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, written on different types of paper in different hands, some typed, some handwritten in careful script. All were addressed to the Virgin Mary, and all carried the same date, August 15th, 1986, the day the statue was dedicated. Walter read the first letter in silence, his face growing pale as he absorbed its contents. Then he read it aloud. "Dear Mary, Mother of God, today we buried my best friend Tommy Morrison. He was killed by a drunk driver last month coming home from his job at the mill. 24 years old, married 6 months, with a baby on the way he'll never see. The man who killed him had been drinking at Murphy's Tavern, same as he did every night after work. Tommy's wife asked me why God let this happen, and I don't have an answer. I only know that something good has to come from something so senseless. We're putting up this statue so Tommy won't be forgotten, and so maybe other drivers will slow down at this curve and remember that someone died here because of choices that can't be undone. I wish I could have saved him. I wish I'd seen the signs and stopped my friend from drinking himself to death years before he got behind that wheel. Your son forgave even those who crucified him. Help me learn to forgive, because hate is eating me alive. Signed, Frank Briggs." The workshop fell silent except for the sound of Walter's ragged breathing, his father's handwriting unmistakable. After all these years, his father's pain preserved in a letter Walter had never known existed. "Your father never told you?" Father Martinez asked gently. Walter shook his head, unable to speak. He opened another letter, then another. The pattern became clear. 23 letters in total, one from each family member or friend affected by drunk driving accidents in the county during 1985 and 1986. The statue wasn't just religious decoration. It was a memorial to the dead and a warning to the living, erected during a particularly deadly period when drunk driving had claimed 7 lives in 12 months. Giuseppe placed a weathered hand on Walter's shoulder. "Read them all, my friend. They are part of your story now." Walter spent the next hour reading every letter. Mrs. Patterson's mother had written about losing her son to a drunk driver on Christmas Eve. Tom Morrison's grandmother had written about her grandson Tommy, the same Tom Morrison who'd arrested Walter the night of his crash. The Kowalski family had lost an uncle. Even Father McKenna had contributed a letter about his brother, killed by a drunk driver in Boston before he came to Millbrook. The final letter was the most devastating. "Mary, I don't know if I believe in you anymore, but I'm writing this anyway, because I have nowhere else to put my anger. My husband Frank lost his best friend to a drunk driver, and now he's drinking more every night, saying it's the only way he can sleep. I'm afraid he's going to become the thing that killed Tommy. I'm afraid our children will lose their father the same way Tommy's family lost him, not to a crash, but to the bottle. I don't know how to save someone who doesn't want to be saved. If you're real, if you listen to prayers from broken people, please help Frank find his way back before he loses everything that matters. I can't lose him too." Signed, Margaret Briggs. Walter's mother, writing about his father, about a drinking problem Walter had never known existed. The pieces of his family's history rearranged themselves like a puzzle, finally solving itself. His father's occasional bad nights that Walter had dismissed as normal adult behavior, the way Frank sometimes smelled like mouthwash in the morning, the periods of extra careful sobriety that young Walter had attributed to work stress. Frank Briggs had struggled with alcohol after losing his best friend to a drunk driver, but unlike his son, Frank had found his way back before destroying his family. He'd quit drinking, thrown himself into work and fatherhood, and never spoke of his friend Tommy or the demons he'd wrestled in private. "He never told me any of this," Walter whispered. "Perhaps he was protecting you," Giuseppe suggested. "Or perhaps he was ashamed of his weakness. Or perhaps," Father Martinez added, "quietly, he was hoping you'd never need to know, that you'd be stronger than he was." Walter looked around the workshop at his half-finished statue, at the tools that had belonged to his father, at the letters that revealed a family legacy of struggling with the same demons that had nearly destroyed him. The irony was crushing. He'd smashed a memorial to drunk driving victims, erected partially in memory of his father's pain, while continuing the cycle of destruction his father had worked so hard to break. "I'm not the first Briggs to battle the bottle," Walter said, his voice hollow with realization. "No," Father Martinez agreed, "but you might be the first to win that battle in public, to turn your recovery into something that helps others avoid the same trap." Giuseppe picked up one of the carving chisels, testing its edge against his thumb. "Your father fought his demons in private, saved his family, built a good life. You have the chance to do more, to make your struggle visible, to help others see that redemption is possible." Walter gathered the letters carefully, understanding that they represented more than family history. They were a calling, a responsibility, to complete not just the statue but the healing work his father had begun 40 years earlier. "The new statue," Walter said slowly, "it can't just replace what I destroyed. It has to honor these letters, these families, the people who died and the people who loved them." "Yes," Giuseppe nodded. "It must be memorial and warning and promise all together." That night, Walter sat in his kitchen with the letters spread before him and his mason jar, now holding over $1,000, on the table beside them. He was no longer just a drunk trying to make amends for a single night's destruction. He was a son carrying forward his father's unfinished work, a member of a community scarred by preventable tragedy, a man whose personal redemption had become something larger than himself. The statue he would create would tell the whole story. Not just his own fall and rise, but the ongoing cycle of loss and healing that had shaped Millbrook for generations. It would be beautiful, but it would also be true, incorporating both. The hope for redemption and the warning about consequences that these families had paid for with blood and tears. The letters changed everything. Walter spent 3 sleepless nights redesigning the memorial statue, sketching ideas that would honor not just the original Virgin Mary, but the 23 families whose pain had inspired its creation. Giuseppe watched his students struggle with the expanded vision, offering guidance when asked, but allowing Walter to work through the artistic and emotional challenges on his own. "Show me," Giuseppe said on Thursday morning, examining Walter's latest drawings. The design was ambitious, a larger statue that maintained the traditional pose of Mary in prayer, but incorporated elements representing the lives lost to drunk driving. The base would be expanded to include a bronze plaque listing names, and the marble work would include subtle symbols of remembrance carved into Mary's robes. "It's beautiful," Giuseppe said quietly. "Also much more work than we planned." The dedication ceremony is scheduled for August 15th, the 40th anniversary of the original statue. That gives us less than 4 months. Can we do it? Giuseppe studied the drawings again, calculating the hours of detailed carving required. For the expanded design, his hands had grown noticeably shakier over the past month, forcing Walter to take on increasingly complex work, while the old master provided guidance and encouragement. "We can try. But Walter, my hands are failing faster than I expected. You'll have to do most of the finish work yourself." The admission carried weight beyond the immediate challenge. Giuseppe was acknowledging that his apprentice had become skilled enough to complete work that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. But it also meant Walter would be largely alone for the most crucial phase of the project. Father Martinez helped coordinate the expanded memorial planning with characteristic efficiency. The church organized fundraising for the bronze plaque and additional marble needed for the larger base. Sarah volunteered to manage communications with the victim families, many of whom still lived in the area and wanted to participate in honoring their lost loved ones. The community response surprised everyone. Word of the discovered letters spread through Millbrook and into neighboring towns, drawing attention from people who'd been touched by similar tragedies. Donations arrived from as far away as the state capital, along with letters of support from families who'd lost members to drunk driving. Emma threw herself into the project with teenage enthusiasm, creating a detailed archive of newspaper clippings about the 1985-1986 accidents and interviewing elderly residents who remembered the original statue dedication. Her high school history. Teacher allowed her to make the memorial the subject of her senior project, giving her work academic credit while helping Walter understand the full scope of what they were creating. "Did you know Grandpa Frank helped build the original statues?" "Base?" Emma asked one evening as she and Walter worked in the shop. Giuseppe had gone home early, exhausted by a morning of detailed carving, leaving them to work on the less delicate preparation tasks. "I didn't know he was involved at all until we found the letters." Emma consulted her research notes. Mrs. Patterson remembers him donating labor for the foundation work. He wouldn't take payment, said it was the least he could do for Tommy Morrison's family. Each new detail about his father's involvement deepened Walter's understanding of the legacy he was continuing. Frank Briggs had channeled his grief and guilt into constructive action, helping create something beautiful in response to devastating loss. Now Walter was doing the same, but on a larger scale and with the entire community watching. Claire attended one of the planning meetings, surprising Walter with her presence and her obvious pride in what he was accomplishing. They spoke briefly afterward, their first real conversation since the divorce papers were signed. "Emma talks about this project constantly," Claire said. "She's proud of you, Walter. We both are. I'm just trying to make things right. You're doing more than that. You're showing her that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define us forever." Claire paused, choosing her words carefully. "I never thought I'd say this, but the man working on this statue is someone I remember. From when we first met. Someone I could have built a life with." The words carried no promise of reconciliation, but they offered something almost as valuable, recognition that Walter's transformation was real and lasting. Claire was acknowledging the man he'd become, rather than focusing on the man he'd been. During their marriage's final years, Giuseppe's decline accelerated in June. Some mornings, he arrived at the workshop, barely able to hold his tools steady, but he refused to abandon the project. Walter found himself in the strange position of caring for his mentor while completing the most challenging work of his apprenticeship. "I should have started teaching you years ago," Giuseppe said one afternoon, watching Walter carve delicate folds into Mary's robes with increasing confidence. "You have gifts that shouldn't be wasted. I didn't know I had any gifts until you showed me. The gifts were always there. I just helped you remember how to use them." The old sculptor had begun sharing stories about his own journey from Italy to America, about the years spent learning his craft and the satisfaction of creating beauty that would outlast its creator. Walter understood that Giuseppe was passing on more than technique. He was sharing the philosophy that had sustained him through decades of patient work. "When this is finished," Giuseppe said, "you should continue. Find your own students. Pass on what you've learned. I'm barely learning myself. That's when teaching is most valuable. You remember what it feels like to not know, to struggle with basics. Master craftsmen sometimes forget those early challenges." July brought intense media attention as news of the memorial project spread beyond the local area. A television crew from the state capitol filmed Walter working on the statue, and a newspaper reporter wrote a feature story about redemption and community healing. The attention made Walter uncomfortable, but Father Martinez convinced him that sharing the story might help other people struggling with addiction see that recovery was possible. "Your journey matters to more than just our community," Father Martinez explained. "Other people need to see that rock bottom can become a foundation for something beautiful." The television interview was awkward, but honest. Walter spoke about his drinking, the crash, and the slow process of rebuilding his life through service to others. He showed the interviewer Giuseppe's workshop, the half-finished statue, and his father's letters, explaining how personal redemption had become a community effort. "What do you want people to take away from your story?" the reporter asked. Walter considered the question carefully. That it's never too late to choose differently. That our worst moments don't have to define us if we're willing to do the work of making things right. The story aired on a Sunday evening in late July, bringing national attention to Millbrook's small-town memorial project. Donations poured in from across the country, along with letters from people sharing their own stories of loss and recovery. One letter particularly moved Walter, from a woman in Oregon whose son had been killed by a drunk driver 5 years earlier. She'd struggled with anger and the desire for revenge until seeing Walter's story. "Watching you turn your mistake into something healing gives me hope that my anger can be transformed too," she wrote. "Thank you for showing that accountability and forgiveness can coexist." Giuseppe's health crisis came in early August, just weeks before the scheduled dedication. He collapsed in the workshop on a Tuesday morning, and Sarah found him when she arrived for her daily check on his condition. The diagnosis was a mild stroke, not life-threatening, but serious enough to end his direct involvement in the project. From his hospital bed, Giuseppe examined photographs of the nearly completed statue with the critical eye of a master craftsman. Walter had done work that exceeded both their expectations, creating something that honored the original while adding layers of meaning that made it uniquely powerful. "It's ready," Giuseppe declared. "The finished work is beautiful, the proportions perfect. All that remains is the installation and blessing." Walter felt simultaneously proud and terrified. In 3 weeks, the entire community would gather to dedicate his work, to judge whether a drunk's attempt at redemption had produced something worthy of their forgiveness and respect. The statue was beautiful, but its true test would come when people saw it as a memorial to their loved ones rather than simply an artistic achievement. The final preparations began immediately. The bronze plaque arrived from the foundry, engraved with 23 names and the dates of their deaths. The expanded base was completed and ready for installation. All that remained was the careful transport of Walter's carved figure from Giuseppe's workshop to County Road 14, where it would stand as testament to the possibility that even the most broken lives could create something whole and beautiful. August 15th dawned clear and warm, the kind of summer day that made Millbrook look like a postcard of small-town America. Walter had been awake since 4 in the morning, pacing his kitchen and checking his prepared remarks for the 100th time. The mason jar that had started his journey sat empty on the counter. Its contents had long since been invested in marble and tools and the bronze plaque that would bear his father's friend's name alongside 22 others. The statue installation had been completed the day before, covered with a white cloth that would be removed during the dedication ceremony. Walter had insisted on being present for every step of the process, watching as the crane lowered his year's work onto the foundation, where the original Mary had stood for 37 years. Giuseppe had been released from the hospital against his doctor's orders, determined to witness the dedication of what he considered his finest collaborative work. He arrived at the ceremony site in a wheelchair pushed by his grandson, his face pale but alert, carrying the bronze dedication plaque Walter had crafted with his guidance. By 10 o'clock, cars lined County Road 14 for half a mile in each direction. The crowd included not just Millbrook residents, but people from neighboring towns, state officials who'd read about the project, and families from as far away as Illinois, who'd lost loved ones to drunk driving and wanted to show support for Walter's redemption effort. Emma stood with her father near the covered statue, wearing a dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion and carrying a folder containing copies of all 23 letters from the time capsule. She'd spent the summer researching each family, tracking down survivors, and creating a memorial booklet that told the story behind every name on the bronze plaque. Claire arrived with her sister, offering Walter a supportive nod across the gathering crowd. Their relationship remained undefined, not reconciled, but no longer broken, built now on shared pride in Emma and cautious respect for the man Walter had become. Sarah positioned herself near the front of the crowd, her nurse's uniform exchanged for a blue dress that had belonged to their mother. She carried a framed photograph of Frank Briggs that would be added to the memorial display. Finally, giving her father's role in the original statue's creation the recognition it deserved. Father Martinez began the ceremony with a prayer that acknowledged both loss and hope, speaking about the cycle of destruction and healing that had brought them together on this August morning. His words carried the weight of 15 years spent, ministering to a community that had seen too much preventable tragedy. "We gather not just to remember the dead," Father Martinez said, "but to celebrate the possibility of redemption, to witness how one man's worst moment became the foundation for something beautiful that will serve this community for generations." The crowd included some faces that still carried skepticism about Walter's transformation. Bill Patterson stood with arms crossed, his expression suggesting he viewed the entire ceremony as an elaborate publicity stunt. But he was outnumbered by people who'd watched Walter's daily work of change, who'd hired him for carpentry projects, or seen him at AA meetings, or simply observed the steady consistency of his sobriety. When Father Martinez called Walter forward to speak, the crowd fell silent, except for the sound of wind moving through the oak trees that lined the road. Walter approached the microphone with the speech he'd written and rewritten dozens of times, but when he looked out at the faces gathered before him, some forgiving, some curious, some still wounded by losses that could never be fully healed, he set the prepared remarks aside. "A year ago I was a drunk who destroyed something beautiful," Walter began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I stood in this exact spot, surrounded by broken marble, and for the first time in years, I saw myself clearly. Not the man I pretended to be, but the man I'd actually become." He gestured toward the covered statue behind him. "What you're about to see isn't just my attempt to replace what I destroyed. It's the work of an entire community that chose to believe in second chances. Giuseppe Torino taught me to carve stone. Father Martinez taught me to face my failures honestly. My sister Sarah taught me that love sometimes means demanding change rather than enabling destruction." Walter's voice caught slightly as he continued. "My daughter Emma taught me that redemption isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up consistently, day after day, proving through actions that change is real and lasting." He pulled out the bronze plaque Giuseppe had handed him, holding it so the crowd could see the 23 names engraved in careful script. "These names represent people who died because someone like me made the choice to drink and drive. People with families, dreams, futures that were cut short by preventable tragedy. I can't bring them back, but I can dedicate the rest of my life to making sure their deaths weren't meaningless." Walter looked directly at Tom Morrison, who stood in uniform near the back of the crowd. "One of these names is Tommy Morrison, best friend of my father, Frank Briggs. My father helped build the original statue's foundation as his way of honoring Tommy's memory. I never knew that story until a few months ago, never understood that the statue I destroyed was connected to my own family's history with the pain that alcohol causes." The silence that followed Walter's words was profound, broken only by the sound of someone crying softly in the crowd. Walter recognized Mrs. Patterson, whose brother's name was engraved on the plaque. Her anger from the town meeting transformed into something that looked like acceptance. "This memorial isn't just about the past," Walter continued, his confidence growing as he spoke from the heart rather than from prepared remarks. "It's about the future, about the choice every driver makes when they've been drinking, about the conversations parents need to have with their children, about the responsibility we all share to protect each other." He gestured to Emma, who stepped forward with the memorial booklet she'd created. "My daughter researched every name on this plaque, every family affected by drunk driving in our county during 1985 and 1986. Their stories aren't just statistics. They're reminders of what we lose when prevention fails." The silence that followed. Walter's words was profound, broken only by the sound of someone crying softly in the crowd. Walter recognized Mrs. Patterson, whose brother's name was engraved on the plaque. Her anger from the town meeting transformed into something that looked like acceptance. "This memorial isn't just about the past," Walter continued, his confidence growing as he spoke from the heart rather than from prepared remarks. "It's about the future, about the choice every driver makes when they've been drinking, about the conversations parents need to have with their children, about the responsibility we all share to protect each other." He gestured to Emma, who stepped forward with the memorial booklet she'd created. "My daughter researched every name on this plaque, every family affected by drunk driving in our county during 1985 and 1986. Their stories aren't just statistics. They're reminders of what we lose when prevention fails." Emma's voice was steady as she read from her research. "Tommy Morrison was 24 years old when he died. He worked at the lumber mill, coached Little League on weekends, and had just learned his wife was pregnant with their first child. Sarah Chen was 19, home from college for summer break, killed by a drunk driver on her way to her job at the library. Michael Patterson was 31, a volunteer firefighter who died responding to an accident caused by someone who'd been drinking at Murphy's Tavern. Each name Emma read carried weight that silence alone couldn't hold. Family members in the crowd nodded recognition, some wiping away tears, others standing straighter as their loved ones were remembered with dignity and specificity. Tom Morrison stepped forward from the back of the crowd, his uniform crisp despite the emotional weight of the moment. "My grandfather Tommy never got to meet me," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering, "but Walter's father made sure I grew up knowing his story." Frank Briggs visited our family every year on the anniversary of the accident, bringing flowers and keeping Tommy's memory alive. He never talked about his own struggle with alcohol, but now I understand why he was so committed to preventing other families from experiencing what we went through. The revelation added another layer to the interconnected web of loss and healing that had brought them together. Frank Briggs hadn't just helped build the original statue. He'd maintained relationships with the victim families, carrying forward Tommy's memory through decades of quiet service. Father Martinez approached the covered statue, his hand resting on the cloth that concealed Walter's year of work. "Before we unveil this memorial, I want to share something that Giuseppe Torino told me from his hospital bed this morning. He said that in 60 years of carving stone, he'd never worked on a piece that carried more meaning or required more courage from its creator." Giuseppe, seated in his wheelchair near the front of the crowd, nodded his agreement. Despite his weakened condition, his eyes held pride and satisfaction as he watched the culmination of his final masterwork. "The statue you're about to see," Father Martinez continued, "incorporates elements from the original memorial, including the marble hands that miraculously survived Walter's crash. Those hands, still clasped in prayer, have been integrated into the new figure as a symbol of continuity between what was lost and what has been rebuilt." Walter felt his heart racing as Father Martinez grasped the cloth covering. This was the moment of truth, when the community would judge whether his year of work had produced something worthy of their forgiveness and respect. The cloth fell away, revealing Walter's creation to sunlight and public scrutiny for the first time. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The statue was larger than the original, carved from the finest Carrara marble Giuseppe could source. Mary stood with her traditional hands clasped in prayer, the very hands that had survived Walter's crash, now seamlessly integrated into the new figure. But Walter had added subtle elements that transformed the traditional pose into something more complex and meaningful. Carved into the folds of Mary's robes were small symbols representing each of the 23 victims: a baseball for Tommy, the Little League coach, a book for Sarah, the college student, a firefighter's helmet for Michael Patterson. The details were subtle enough not to disturb the statue's classical beauty, but present enough to honor each individual life lost. The bronze plaque at the statue's base bore all 23 names, along with a simple inscription Walter had written, "In memory of lives lost to preventable tragedy. 2. In hope that their deaths can save others, in commitment to the ongoing work of redemption and healing." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Patterson approached the statue, her fingers tracing the small flame carved into Mary's robe that represented her brother Michael. She looked at Walter with eyes that held something he'd never expected to see. "Gratitude. It's beautiful," she said simply. Michael would be honored. Others moved forward to examine the memorial more closely, finding the symbols that represented their lost family members. The crowd's energy shifted from formal ceremony to something more intimate and personal as people discovered the care Walter had taken to honor each individual story. As the official ceremony concluded, someone left a single white rose at the statue's base, placed anonymously but with clear intention. Walter never discovered who had left it, but he understood its message. Forgiveness was possible. Healing could occur, and even the most broken lives could create something beautiful and lasting. Giuseppe's grandson wheeled the old sculptor closer to the statue for a final examination. Giuseppe's weathered hands traced the marble surface with the reverence of a master craftsman, appreciating work that exceeded his expectations. "Perfect," Giuseppe whispered, his voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of professional approval earned over 6 decades. "Walter, you have become the artist I always knew you could be." The crowd began to disperse gradually, but many lingered to speak with Walter, to share their own stories of loss and recovery, to express gratitude for his commitment to making amends through action rather than just words. The memorial had become more than a replacement for what he'd destroyed. It had become a focal point for community healing that would continue long after this day's ceremony ended. 1 year after the memorial dedication, Walter's business card read, W. Briggs, Restoration and Repair, with Giuseppe Torino listed as Partner Emeritus. The old sculptor had passed peacefully in his sleep 6 months after the ceremony, his final project complete, and his legacy secured in the hands of a student who had exceeded every expectation. Walter's workshop occupied the building that had once housed Giuseppe's studio, filled now with projects that ranged from antique furniture restoration to memorial stonework for families across 3 counties. The skills Giuseppe had taught him had evolved into a craft that honored both function and beauty, creating work that would last generations. Emma stopped by the workshop most Saturdays before heading to college classes at the State University. She was studying art history with a focus on memorial design, inspired by her research into the statue project and her father's transformation from destroyer to creator. Their relationship had strengthened into something deeper than the simple parent-child bond. They were collaborators now, united by shared respect for craftsmanship and the belief that broken things could be made beautiful again. "Mrs. Henderson wants you to restore the library's reading tables," Emma said, examining Walter's latest project, a Civil War-era headstone that had been damaged by vandals. "Apparently, your reputation for bringing dead wood back to life has spread beyond Millbrook." Walter smiled at his daughter's gentle teasing. Emma had inherited her mother's quick wit, but tempered it with a warmth that reminded him of his own mother. She'd grown into a young woman who understood both forgiveness and accountability, qualities that would serve her well in whatever career she chose. "Tell Mrs. Henderson I'll look at them next week. This memorial needs to be finished first." The headstone restoration was pro bono work, Walter's contribution to maintaining the town cemetery where his parents were buried. He'd made it a practice to donate 1 project per month to community service, a way of ensuring that his success remained connected to something larger than profit. Claire visited the workshop occasionally, usually when picking up Emma or discussing their daughter's college expenses. Their relationship had settled into something comfortable and respectful, not romantic, but based on shared pride in Emma's accomplishments and Walter's sustained transformation. "You look happy," Claire observed one autumn afternoon, watching Walter sand a mahogany table with the patient precision that had become his trademark. "I am happy. For the first time in years, I'm doing work that matters." "Emma says you're sponsoring someone new in AA." Walter nodded, thinking of Marcus, a 28-year-old construction worker whose drunk driving accident had injured a family of 4. Marcus was struggling with the same guilt and shame that had nearly destroyed Walter, and their weekly meetings had become as important to Walter as to his sponsee. "Helping others work through their mistakes helps me remember how far I've come." "Dad would be proud," Claire said, using the present tense that acknowledged Frank Briggs' continuing influence on Walter's choices. Sarah's weekly visits had evolved from concerned check-ins to genuine friendship between siblings who'd rediscovered their affection for each other. She often brought dinner and stayed to help with workshop organization, their conversations ranging from family memories to Sarah's work at the hospital and Walter's growing reputation as a craftsman. "I have news," Sarah announced one evening in late October, her smile suggesting the news was good. "Tell me." The State Highway Department wants to commission you for memorial markers at 3 accident sites where drunk driving victims died. They heard about our statue project and want something similar for other dangerous curves. The offer represented both professional recognition and personal validation. Walter's work was being sought not just for its artistic merit, but for its emotional authenticity, the credibility that came from someone who understood both the destruction and the healing process. "I'll need help," Walter said, already planning how to expand his workshop to handle larger projects. "I know someone who might be interested. Marcus told me he's been thinking about learning a trade that doesn't involve power tools and concrete." The idea of training his AA sponsee in restoration work appealed to Walter. Marcus had the physical strength for stone carving and the emotional investment in creating memorials that honored victims rather than just commemorating tragedy. Father Martinez remained Walter's closest friend and most trusted advisor. Their relationship deepened by shared experience of redemption and service. The priest often stopped by the workshop for coffee and conversation, sometimes bringing parishioners who needed furniture repaired or memorial work completed. "Giuseppe would be amazed by what you've accomplished," Father Martinez said one evening, examining a carved baptismal font Walter was restoring for a church in the neighboring county. "I think about him every day. Wonder what he'd say about each project. He'd say the same thing he told me in the hospital, that the student has become a master and the circle of teaching continues." The Virgin Mary statue had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, visited by families affected by drunk driving from across the region. Walter maintained the memorial site, cleaning the marble monthly and ensuring the bronze plaque remained readable. He'd installed a small bench nearby where visitors could sit quietly, and he often found flowers or notes left by people seeking comfort or resolution. On quiet evenings, Walter would walk to the statue and spend a few minutes in reflection, sometimes talking to Giuseppe's memory, sometimes to his father's, sometimes just enjoying the peace that came from work, completed with integrity and skill. The mason jar that had started his restoration fund sat in a place of honor on his workshop shelf, no longer collecting money, but serving as a reminder of how small beginnings could grow into something significant. Next to it sat Giuseppe's carving, tools and his father's measuring square, instruments of precision that had shaped both wood and stone and the man who used them. Walter's daily routine remained anchored in sobriety meetings, regular work, and the steady accumulation of projects that left the world slightly more beautiful than he'd found it. He'd learned to measure success not in grand gestures, but in consistent choices, in showing up each day ready to do work that mattered. At 47, Walter Briggs had become the man his father had always believed he could be, someone who built rather than destroyed, who faced his mistakes honestly and transformed them into opportunities to serve others. The drunk who'd crashed into a statue had died that August night on County Road 14. In his place stood a craftsman, a father, a friend, and a living testament to the possibility that redemption could grow from the most shattered foundations if tended with patience, honesty, and hope.